on this morning, and thank you again for our prior speaker. For those of you who are getting something to eat, drink, please feel free to do so. So we're going to start our next panel, which is called the Genocidal State. My name is Temoney, and I'm a professor at Montclair State University. I'm also the chair of the Department of Religion there, and I am a genocide scholar, genocide scholar. I'm trained in religious ethics, and I currently work with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum on a committee on religious ethics in the Holocaust. I'm also an editor for the Genocide Studies Prevention. It's a journal, and I also am a former co-chair of the American Academy of Religion, and they have a religion, Holocaust, and genocide kind of unit. So I publish a lot on theory of history, genocide, human rights, religion. So I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for the invitation to be here, and thank you again to Becky and to Erica and to Kalani and to Tim and to everyone who's organized this, and to Volker. And so we're going to go ahead and get started by doing an introduction. For those of you who have access to the web on your phone or otherwise, you can read the full bio. But just to kind of get it started, I'm just going to give you a couple sentences about our two esteemed kind of speakers here this morning. And just to give you a kind of quick sense of how things are going to work. They're both going to present for about 20 minutes. They both have presentations that you'll be able to see here that are projected. And then they're also going to have a chance to ask each other a question after that 20-minute presentation, and then we'll open it up to the audience. We like a little variety around here, so we'll kind of keep it going for you. And then welcome to everybody there in Zoom land. We're very happy that you're able to join us. We also have a Q&A where you'll also be able to ask. And if you're wondering, this is all natural. This is not counting. Okay. So our first, took you a second. So our first presenter is Alex Hinton. He's at Rutgers University, and Alex is Distinguished Professor of Anthropology, Director of the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights, and UNESCO Chair in Genocide Prevention at Rutgers. And he is the award-winning author of, I think it's not a typo, 17 books, including Why Did They Kill? Cambodia in the Shadow of Genocide, The Justice Facade, Trials of Transition in Cambodia, and Man or Monster, and then the trial of Khmer Rouge, Portugal. And so I'll let you again read the rest of his bio. Yeah, please. And our next presenter, and I have to point this out in just a moment, is Edward Westermann at Texas A&M. And I can't help but notice that your picture and your outfit match. Last year, I did exactly the same thing. I gave a lecture, and I said, and you can see my picture, and I was wearing exactly the same thing in my bio. So I feel you on that. Edward B. Westermann received his doctorate from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And is a Regents Professor of History and a Piper Professor of 2023 at Texas A&M at the University of San Antonio. He has published extensively on the Holocaust and military history, including Hitler's Westermann and the Indian Wars, comparing genocide and conflict, and Hitler's police battalions enforcing racial war in the East and German anti-aircraft defense, 1914 and 1945. And again, I'll leave it to you to read the rest of their impressive and illustrious bios. So without further ado, our very first presenter is going to be Dr. Hinton, and he is actually going to come to the podium.
Troublemaker.
Yes, you are, and I will find you.
A little trickery going on. Yesterday, I was like, oh, it's 30 minutes, and now it's 20. So I'm just going to stop. Even brought props and devices and different things. Thanks for listening. You don't need to look at me. You know, that's much more interesting. But we didn't want to the whole time. So we'll okay. To begin, I just want to add to the long list of thank yous, but especially Professor thank you for all you've done. But I know, I heard in the introduction saying how many other people are involved, and some of the director center. I fully appreciate all those efforts, even the students. Okay, so to begin, I just want to wake you up from the coffee break. Play a little song. There's a method to the madness. Bear with me. How many people want to hear the rest of the song? I'm not going to say that. Everyone. Yeah. So wake up a little bit here. Is it okay if we use the arrows? I will return just to wake you up. It's a mnemonic device. We'll get there eventually. It is sort of serves as the title of my presentation, what I'm going to speak about today. Nation state, but I'm also going to weave my way down from macro level to micro level, and just to warn you, into the torture chamber. So about content a little bit coming up, but a bit of background. So I've given research focuses in part on far right extremism in the U.S. But I've worked for many years in Cambodia. I think a couple talks about other research. I'm only going to briefly touch on it. I guess I'm not going to for those extra 5 minutes I had. I was going to go to the U.S., so I will touch the U.S. But I know some of you used to be everybody knew about Cambodia. Now people not so much. Everybody seems to be going to. So from 1975 to 1979, Khmer Rouge, who were Maoist-inspired Marxist-Leninist revolutionaries, seized power, sort of the shockwave of the Vietnam War. When they took power, they implemented perhaps the most rapid, most extreme revolution in history, collectivized society, kicked everyone out of the cities, into the countryside, and then a span of 3 years, someone knows Cambodia, 3 years, 9 months, and 20 days, they proceeded to enact policies that resulted in the demolition of culture. So they, had they remained in power, probably looked a little bit like North Korea, maybe where they were headed, but they were toppled. Geopolitics, oddly, by another socialist country, Vietnam. That's a longer story, not one I can tell. Khmer Rouge were led by Pol Pot. You haven't heard of them? We look up most evil people, top 5 list, usually number 4 or 5, something like that. Brother number 2, worked hand in hand with them, Gia. Pol Pot died in the late 1990s, 1998, I think. He recently died, and he died after being tried at the Khmer Rouge tribunal in Cambodia that started in 2006. So, what was it like in Cambodia? Well, life was, of course, not very good, as we've already surmised. And a lot of Cambodians said, talked about it at the time, and they said to survive, you can't see anything, hear anything, don't say anything. Another thing, plant a kapok tree, which means for me, build the tree, but it means for me. This is the saying. So, thinking about this, sort of wondering that. This is coming, I promise. It's still coming. We went from Hannah Arendt to Tom Petty, believe it or not. So Hannah Arendt and her studies of totalitarianism talked about different features of the totalitarian regime. Part of that is the interaction decreases, people become atomized in the public sphere. So if we think about this in a different sort of way, of democracy in the US, right? Big, different features of government, free press, different checks, so on and so forth, and a totalitarian regime, we can visualize it. So going to divide my remarks today, maybe. I'm only going to get to the statistics close possibly, with 5 images, maybe. The first is a plot twist. Second is a crocodile. And the third is this, let's not sure about the snake for so plot twist. Somebody hanging about the connection on the song that I put on. What's the plot? Well, once upon a time in Cambodia, I was called to testify at that tribunal as expert witness. I can talk for the next 20 minutes just about that at length. I mean, do a tiny bit of it. I was called to testify in large part on the charge of genocide. And people on trial, well, I wrote a book about that guy, Doig, on the bottom. He was the head of S-21 prison interrogation center. I'm going to take you in there a little bit. That's when we're going to dive into the torture chamber. But at the time I testified, his trial was over, he was convicted, he died in prison. Nguyen Gia Phu Song Hwan on the trial. So when I went to court each day, for years after studying the court, interviewing everyone at the court for both, I suddenly was on the hot seat, as I came to think of it. I brought 3 objects with me, 3 images. So the first was a copy of the Khmer Rouge national emblem. I did this for myself of the state orchestration, actually would say the high modernist orientation of the regime. So what do I mean by that? Well, so even though many people view the Khmer Rouge as sort of rule backwards, quote unquote, they actually very much were influenced by high modernist ideology. See the statement from Paul Pot, how do you get your Communist Party line? We analyze society, find out what contradictions are. And so the regime, what they did was very much influenced by different things associated with modernity, abstraction, bureaucracy, categorization, progress, reason, scientific rationality, dividing people into units, types, units is what they call them, and elements. And that is certainly what they did. So I wanted to keep that in mind, because that's testifying. Gia was right at the top. So the plot twist is that Nguyen Gia boycotting the tribunal, politicized and lots of other stuff. Similar things going on right now in the U.S., I guess, a little bit. I make an equation between the two. I'm just saying the thought of that though, just saying the politicized court. And he suddenly announced that he didn't like what Hinton said. He was going to come up and tell me a thing or two, So suddenly, from the depths of he had a holding cell, or came up and tried to cheat me out. That's really what I've said. That story either, but I actually wrote a book about it on their end. But I will tell you a little bit about his defense. This gets into second image, the crocodile. Tom Petty, why I brought that up purposely, plot twist, crocodile. Well, the crocodile is the name of Nguyen Gia's defense argument. So that actually is a good argument in some ways. It's an agrarian metaphor. So you have society, sort of like our history that's like a crocodile. Court, it's heavily political. U.S. is not going to give the thumbs up if you talk about U.S. bombing. China is not going to give the thumbs up if you talk about China's support for the Khmer Rouge. So they say, well, we're going to, law, have this thing called jurisdiction. You trunk it down to the period of Khmer Rouge rule, which is the trunk or body of the crocodile. And they said, look, you don't pay attention to the head or the tail. What happened before, after? That's a reasonable argument. Has some merit. He said other things. So when he began, he said, I'm going to tell everybody the truth of what happened. In fact, he's not talking about the 2 million people who died out of the 8 million people in Cambodia. But I was actually trying to do a morally good thing, trying to rescue the poor who were oppressed by capitalists. So he stated this at the beginning before he went on his boycott. So in interviews, he did a series of interviews before he was arrested. So here's an example of him invoking that high modernist language that I mentioned, right? We set out to transform society, wanted a clean, a lot of purity metaphors. They had the formulation of the DK party line. And this line consisted of 3 components: politics, organization, and consciousness. The politics component of it is already what I told you before: society politically reordered, so according to Marxist-Leninism, that's the class composition, definitions of the enemy, terms like struggle, build and defend the country. Of course, we have the divisions of us and them. These were not singular; they changed over time. So at first, when they came into power, it was against people from the old regime. And officials went forward. You had internal enemies, traitors, and then by then you had people who had mere bodies or shifting minds. So when Gia never, for the most part, admitted that they killed people, but sure enough, in this interview, this was introduced to the court. So look, people who can be redeemed were enemies. We killed them, right? But they categorized them. So we're back to this high modernist language. Well, in terms of the organizational line, this meant things like we're going to collectivize society, divide people into teams, work, people eat collectively, so on and so forth. But it also meant organizing society so you could round up the enemies. So when they went on trial, in law, they have this thing called a joint criminal enterprise. Any lawyers? It's another conference. Everybody's a lawyer. I feel like you're going to arrest me or something. But I made it here. That's a good news. Anyways, they have this thing called JCE, Joint Criminal Enterprise. And so they're basically saying there's a bunch of people that get together and they organize a bunch of criminal policies. And the 2 different ones I mentioned, the forced transfer, the forced marriage and rape, which is something they got convictions for. They got convictions for all that. But they also had security and execution centers. Marriage, had an elaborate security apparatus all the way to the ground level for people. Remember that they used creep around at night. Cambodia, the house or miles. People would go underneath, listen to what people were saying, spy on people. Very, very formalized, structured system. We're finding this. Okay, statistics list. I forgot to time myself. Oh my God. Looking, well, I'm not sure. I didn't start my clock. Figures. All right.
Another minute after that, we'll be okay.
The song, that didn't count, did it?
Well, it certainly did.
All right, anyway, statistics list. So Joy, the head of S21, he was tried in 2009, was a mathematician, mathematics, best student in mathematics, high school. College, but he had to drop out. Someone told high school. Get there. Would not have become a university. I don't know if you've ever seen a lot of those old movies. They always have an evil person, and the time patient's always the professor. Like studied a lot. Maybe it makes sense. Well, pot. Another story. So Deutsch was, highly intelligent mathematician, and he had sort of a bunch of documents were preserved, and he kept a ledger with his lessons that he gave to the torturers. He called it the statistics. Again, long story to that, but you sort of get the gist of it. We go back to categorization, reification, abstraction, right? Numbers, people being not numbers. So you literally pulled it. At S21, we have this chain of command that went from Meru's leaders at the top, one of which was Gia, San Sen, which is another one, but UNG at one point had direct oversight after 1977 over Deutsch, and they communicated constantly. Deutsch in turn did a bunch of stuff, but he was the one who instructed and read the confession. So you had this direct relay going down from the bottom, back up at the top, where confessions were read by Deutsch, and picked back up at the top. So S21 is at the top of the series of, I think, the most important prisoners. So the second object I brought with me was this painting done by Westermann, and I brought it to remind myself of the suffering. So we have the abstraction, but I also wanted to stick around this tonight. Well, what had happened to Westermann painted the story of his life is actually built on under painting. So at S21, which is located in the capital of Cambodia, operating directly under the regime, he's arrested with his wife, never sees her again, never sees kids again. He's taken in, never separated. They immediately would take biographical information, snap photos. Maybe some people explain the museum that's there now are seeing the photograph that circulate all over. The mugshots were taken. People put in communal cells, emaciated, food, skin disease, lice, all that sort of stuff. And then they were taken to an individual cell. You see at the end there. Eventually, then they were taken and tortured, multiple ways. How to flip, lots of other stuff happened until they would produce confessions with a full detail of their creators. Most people were then taken out and filled in the killing field. Just a picture of sites, ditch, but he could paint. He's an artist, and so they kept him alive. Great propaganda art. So the third image I brought with me was a confession, cover of a confession. On this confession, you can't really see it. There's a check mark at the upper right hand corner where I have the three here. That check mark is called down below, there was something from San Sen, who working with Deutsch before Gia, for number 2 was. Below that, it was handwriting. Deutsch, below that, handwriting from the interrogators. So this illustrates, people at the top didn't know, this illustrates the chain of command. In this case, it was directly connected up and down, right? So they were overseeing interrogation. So I brought this to remind you of this chain of command. It utilized in a different manner, all down to the Meng experience. When you think of the different ways to categorize these structures and come up with them, they all have limitations because they just think inside at the top. The stories vary, but because the architect organizers, facilitators, right? When you at the top one, organizers level more when Deutsch is operating, then we have the people on the ground who are doing actual interrogation. So if we look at what Deutsch is telling his interrogators, you see here this language, right? They talk about enemies, they talk about the mastery, they talk about building the country. So if you see before the DK political line that I mentioned, you see it being implemented directly into the lessons that are being taught to the interrogators. In addition, each person in DK is supposed to fashion their consciousness constantly. It's almost like Buddhism. They're constantly trying to focus your awareness on that, which is used actually for consciousness, for the term used for revolutionary consciousness, thinking about Buddhist language, something time. And ultimately, each person was constantly had to hammer and anvil, look and feel. That was your mind. You constantly had to forge. They thought, also had to act it, and they monitored people constantly. So stories you could tell. So again, right, if we're going from the top to the bottom, we move from the DK party line that I said at the top to Deutsch, who then is passing it along to shape the consciousness of the interrogators, who then move into the torture chamber. Go to the torture. You don't want to hear about the torture chamber. So I'll go quick now, like 1 minute. So you can see the same language in the torture chamber being used as they construct the prisoner confessions, which ultimately then are produced to be in accordance with the DK party line. So if I am a prisoner, I'm arrested because they didn't like my faction, I then become a CIA. Right? Yeah, so this is the framing, the story that could be told. Not if that's without this.
We can hang on.
Yeah, we're gonna skip, you know, U.S., Trump, our current predicament, and all that other stuff. Ask me in the Q&A if you want. You know, Snake, and take a little bit of Hunt Morrison. All right, maybe I set it up this way so I can flip through quickly and not do that. Back to the public sphere and Tom Petty, right? Stories we tell. So this is something coming out. It's always around us in terms of the space of what we're able to say, what we're not able to say, which is around us, Gaza, right? Israel right now, it's something more afraid to speak out. A lot of people are down to what happens is, this is a small example, not to think as well, of something we're always with. What stories can be possible? What can we say? What can't we say? And this is something that's like that in politics. But ultimately, this is sort of the point I was trying to make with that song, is that to be attuned to not just the extremes of totalitarianism, but democracy, we're always on sort of this continuum, and we always need to pay attention to ability, like to tell stories. Where in Cambodia, you couldn't tell stories. There was one story you could tell, had to report with the TK party line, and that was it. So I will stop there and sort of run some different books. I'll end with a picture of Toni Morrison. And thanks for the extra minute.
So next we're going to have Dr. Westermann, and we're going to get to slide.
Okay, I don't start with the song, but I am giving you a world premiere because as of yesterday, the concept of genocidal camaraderie is still not showing up on Google. So that's my term, and that's what I'll be talking about today. As I talk about it, this idea of the intoxication of violence is something I want to talk to you about. And in my last book, Drunk on Genocide, I looked at literal and metaphorical intoxication. And as I was doing that book, one of the things that became apparent to me was the way in which public acts of transgression and competition take place amongst men and sometimes amongst women, and the way that rituals in masculinity are incorporated into that. And so as I was thinking about that concept, this is what I came up with. And so this is the world premiere of this discussion. And thinking about the way in which perpetrators use rituals and incorporate rituals such as drinking, eating, singing and music, group sexual violence, hunting, plundering, and other things as a kind of festive or spectacular violent event. And then as I end this discussion, I talk about how these acts constituted specific rituals that created these communities of violence, and that they established this sense of what I call genocidal camaraderie. So I'd like to dig into that concept today. And if you think about rituals, I've kind of already introduced some of them. So I'll go ahead and build this slide. as some of the things that, as I've looked at comparative data, and today Providence told us about Rwanda, and that is also incorporated into some of what she talked about today. Song and singing incorporated by the perpetrators, eating, barbecues, killing itself. But these are some of the things that I think really, if you will, link different cases of genocidal violence on the part of the perpetrator. And we can talk in terms of Rwanda, we can talk in terms of Nazi Germany, we can talk in terms of Bosnia, and I think from Dr. Hinton's talk and his work on Cambodia, we see some of the same thing, the ritualization that takes place. So in looking at this topic, a couple of things that I've talked about before, Deanne Fuji, who talks about extra-lethal violence, that kind of gratuitous violence. Why is it that people want to perform violence on others in public forums, right? And we see the way in which it's embedded as part of the strategic calculation she talked about, but this performative nature of violent acts. And that's not limited to Nazi Germany or Rwanda. For example, if you think about the Jim Crow South, lynching becomes performative violence in many places. And you see that in the way that postcards are made of lynching themes. You see that in the way of who's participating, men, women, children. You see that in the expressions of those who are on photographs as well. So the way in which this performative lens allows us to think about staging violence for graphic effect. And then as I was kind of developing this idea, the idea of violence on display, the idea of thinking about how this performance takes place, and I'll build this. Rudolf Höss, who was a commandant of Auschwitz, and if you watch Zone of Interest, if that's something you've been looking at, it's about his family and this idea that he talks about in his death row memoir, the idea that his guards perform violence as a kind of entertainment, as he talked about. And when we think about genocide, we don't necessarily think about things like eating or banquets that took place. And if I'm looking at the German East, the Nazi East, this is from a young Ukrainian girl at the time. She was a young girl. And later on, as Father Patrick Dubois was interviewing her with this team in Ukraine when she was an old woman, she talked about how the perpetrators gathered around at these killing sites and they wanted food at the site. And they were drinking, they were singing, and they were killing. And I want you to think about a couple of things that we normally don't do. Number one, the way in which the perpetrators are moving from killing that's up close and personal, in which literally they're covered with the body napkins, those that they just shot, and sitting down then 50 meters, 100 meters away from the killing site and eating and drinking and going back and forth. And how does drinking and singing at these sites also influence the way we think about the perpetrator? And as Providence talked about, that's something we also see in other cases. The idea that after Tutsis were killed and their cattle were taken, that the perpetrators, the Hutu perpetrators, gathered in the cabarets, the so-called bars or pubs, and they had a barbecue, they drank, they took the loot that they had taken from the victim, and they separated that out. So we start to see the way in which community building, community forming violence is now incorporated not only into murder, but post-murder festive activities, if you will. And we can look again, and again, this may be the question that I asked Dr. Hinton to talk about Cambodia, because the way in which we see, again, these activities, and I ask you to think about what does it mean if you read testimonies of people, especially when there's lots of blood. They talked about the terrible smell that's incorporated with murder. And some victims talk about that murder has its own smell. and to sit down then and literally eat at those sites. It's a physiological barrier that you're overcoming in this case. And I think that that's sometimes things that we don't incorporate because we see a picture and we can't smell it. We can't hear what's going on. The idea also in performing violence with women, in this case, men performing for women or women supporting men. So in the case of Rwanda, women who are singing songs to encourage the men, in this case, in murder, right? The idea of the way in which masculinity and this idea of music or song can be incorporated. And I'm going to go kind of fast because I love that our moderator she's right on it. So I agree. So here again, we see celebration taking place after the killing. The drinking of alcohol, this kind of literal intoxication that's married to this idea of metaphorical intoxication. And we see it in the testimony of the survivors and of the perpetrators. And a book that I borrow heavily from here is Machete Season by Jean Hutzfeld, which is a great book. I highly encourage it. If you're undergrad, read it, you'll like it, trust me. It's terrible, but it's fast. So here again, we're looking at this idea of genocidal camaraderie that I talked about. It's talking about the cabaret or the bars in which this takes place, especially after these events. And as Providence talked about earlier, that the perpetrators are gathering and made bets on our victims, spoke mockingly of cut girls, right? And the way in which the perpetrators reflected on the women that they killed or that they sexually assaulted, or the men that they abused at the same time, kind of again gives us some idea and how celebrating these acts of killing. These are some pretty horrific testimonies if you think about it. But dancing around fires, drunk and hysterical, they show off the spoils from the dead. Here again, the idea of sexual violence is incorporated. And here in playing with it, this is something that you see in Nazi Germany when I talked about what the SS and policemen do, but the actual integration of victims as playthings for the killer. Again, giving us an insight into the way they're performing for one another. And here a case of Rwanda where we see it as well. This is a bar outside the Warsaw Ghetto. It's the bar for Police Battalion 61. It's called the Krokmalna Bar, which is a street that runs through the ghetto. And what probably surprises you if you look at that, a German police bar, if you look at the fact that they have like the right picture, it's a Star of David, a very cynical appropriation of a Jewish symbol, right, in the bar. So if we were standing at that bar and we were to turn around in that bar, what we would see would be these tables. And what probably comes to mind that you see is also the mural. Those are self-drawn murals by the policemen, and they depict the duties that they're performing in the Warsaw Ghetto, including one where a Jewish man is reaching down for a potato, and you have a policeman with his rifle level ready to shoot them. And so this is the place they gather. But before we got into that bar, one of the things that we would have noted is we would have reached for the door to go into that bar. And on that door, we would have seen notches in groups of 5. And eventually there'll be 500 notches in that building. So what does that mean? The policemen that came back from duty that day, they counted their score. They used their bayonet or their knife to carve in notches of the number of victims they killed. Okay? They were competing in that way and using that door as a score. We see this again in the areas in which this celebration takes place. Again, I'm not going to go through all these sources, but when you see survivors, in this case, a Rwandan female survivor, talking about the perpetrators involved in carousing, in tomfoolery, right? It gives you an indication of what the perpetrator's mindset as they're embarking on this type of killing. And since we can't climb into that mind, it's their behaviors and actions that we have to use to kind of think about what those men were thinking and what they were doing. And as I said, my last book, Drunk on Genocide, looks at alcohol and the way that perpetrators themselves integrated alcohol. And one of the things we know from social sciences literature, and for those of you in college, I was in college once too for a very long time. But the answer is, right, we know what alcohol abuse and aggression and larceny and physical and sexual violence that can come out of it. We know sports teams, we know fraternities, we know that men and women can be involved in this. So the idea of the way that we drink and how we use alcohol and the things that it's incorporated in, I think are important. And one of the things that really sticks out in my mind, and I'll build this slide because I think it's an important one, those who can count the number that they've given, right? Because they're performing with others, and if I've got more than you, I'm better than you, I'm tougher than you. And this last one really struck me when I was doing the last book. Is there's a German administrator. He's going into what's known as the German House, which is for expatriate Germans only in Poland, occupied Poland. And he hears like this celebration going on. It's midday. So he reaches for the door and he sees this SS guy coming out. But what he notices about the guy is he's got a beer coaster on his uniform in the number 1000 in red. And when he asks the guy, what's going on? What's the celebration? The guy turns to him and says, man, today I'm celebrating my 1000th conviction. Literally the idea of shooting somebody in the back of the neck. He was keeping score and his buddies were celebrating that accomplishment of mass murder. And here again, as we look at other cases, it's not just about Nazi Germany that we see. How in Rwanda, again, we can see the same type of dynamic of individuals keeping score and rating one another based on what they've done. And at the second book, Heineken and Anthropology, actually, I think that's a great book as well, talks about literally the Hinton company and talks about alcohol in Africa. But if you look at it, it talks again here about game playing and keeping score. So here again, we're seeing the way in which perpetrator mentality are also tied to the way that they see their performance. And that can be tied to alcohol as a reward. And this is what I was talking about earlier. It is known that many women acted as kinds of cheerleaders who were singing songs while the men wait until curtsy. And this is where I think it's important to talk about the idea that when we speak of gender, if you've read Wendy Lauer's Hitler's Theory, we know that women perform genocide. Genocidal societies are not just men killing, it's men and women. Now the numbers may vary, and sometimes the roles may vary, but it requires both in order to do it.
Oh, you got more like that.
Oh, wow. Okay, good. I'm gonna slow down a little bit. Okay, I got scared with
You got my minute.
yeah, I got it. I stole it, man. Yeah, but we also then see here as we talk about how in fact that women in research has shown, right? This is one of the things my students are surprised about. Obviously, we talk about Holocaust, right? If women kill, and I'm teaching, of course, gender this semester, and we see, right, the incorporation of women in killing. And certainly, this is what a lot of people think about. Okay, the idea of women and certainly this kind of paradigm, monster or mother, that kind of way in which women are described. But in fact, those are just descriptions. But the idea is that it's a description that we give to women because we can't imagine women in these other roles. And to break down those kinds of gender stereotypes, especially with respect to genocide and genocidal camaraderie, I think is really an important point. And this slide, I think it should also kind of recalibrate the way in which we think about gender. And I'll point to the part that Adam Jones himself put in italics. Strikingly, the survey found that 41.1% of the perpetrators of sexual violence against women were themselves women, while 90% of the assailants were themselves men. In both cases, the perpetrators were overwhelmingly men. And he ends this by saying it challenges the myth that women do not have the capacity to commit such atrocities. So again, I think when we're talking in these terms, we have to also be thinking about society that's a larger construct. And looking at now the Balkans, we see in fact the way in which some of the ideas, the way in which some of these concepts can also be transposed into other cases of mass atrocity and mass killing, especially when we talk about the idea of how sexual violence is used and against whom it's used. So, I'll go ahead and build here as well. So in looking at Bosnia, the idea of the way in which the perpetrators themselves, Serbian perpetrators against Bosnian women, thought about forced impregnation as a way to destroy the Bosnian society. Because in the perpetrator's mind, the impregnation of a Bosnian woman by a Serbian man created a Serbian baby, right? And it also, based on religion and honor and shame for that woman, she had to make a very difficult choice, because to keep the child essentially ended her ability at marriage. And so you have discussion when Dr. Drakulich talks about where women, Bosnian women delivered, midwives delivered, killed those babies because they wanted to give those women an opportunity not to live under the shadow of that sexual assault. So here again, sexual violence continues to live on, right? In the case of its effects on these women, and this targeting of biology that I'm talking about gets to that. And this is exactly the example of what I'm speaking. The occupation of the movement as we talk about. And I think again, as I kind of wrap up, I really want to complicate our understanding, because again, when we think about sexual violence, we naturally, because of the numbers, we think about it implicitly on women. But the idea that sexual violence is itself part and parcel, aimed at degrading and humiliating the individual, that it is not just of one gender and one kind. And here, of course, this Will Storr's book on the rape of men, or story actually, an article, gets to this discussion. And if we look at Bosnia again, where I'll go ahead and wrap this up, of the 6,000 concentration camp inmates in Sarajevo, you see that 80% of those men reported that they had been raped in the nation. Acts of abuse throughout the conflict were often quite graphic, including severe genital mutilation and forced incest. And that last one is something we also see in the Institute. The forcing of the victim to have sexual intercourse for the gratification of the perpetrator. The humiliation of the victim, but the perpetrators using that as kind of a stage intervening. And so on that horrific graphic, I think we'll
so much. And thank you for being spot on with the timing of your presentation. That was perfect. And so now what I would like to do is to actually give you an opportunity to talk to each other. So many of you who have come to a lot of these, sometimes you don't get a chance to interact with each other on these panels. And so it's great for you and it's great for them to have that opportunity. So if you have a question for each other, we can spend like say the next 10 minutes, like having that conversation, and then we'll open up to you in the audience.
So Alex, I'm gonna ask you a question. You want to tell us about the snake?
The snake. Gone a long time about the snake. Truncated, because I don't want to take up too much time. You know, that was about 10 minutes of top time that I had in there. So the snake is a parable that Trump started telling back in 2015. He told us recently is February of this year. Based on Aesop fable, and the short version of it is a woman going down walking along, finds a poor half-roasted snake as it goes in the Aesop fable, takes it in, nurses back to health, goes to work, comes back one day, snake bites her. When you bite me, you're poisonous, you'll be killed at the end. Of course, you know, you knew it was dangerous. And so this is always framed as, I'm going to tell you a story about immigration. I'm going to tell you a story about Muslim terrorists, right? So it's always framed this way. And I think that's exactly what he said in February. I actually also had a clip of him doing that. That was my other clip. Tom Petty and Donald Trump. Two clips for the day. So I was going to play that. So to sort of go down and the link to Toni Morrison, the idea is, again, in terms of what can be said and what can be thought, there's a constriction. This is a parable of white genocide. And there's a larger discussion about the bifurcation of dialogue, how people on both the left and the right see each other as constricting free speech. As you know, so on one side you get the woke agenda, another you get the incipient fascist takeover. Actually, both sides think that, and you have this sort of these discussions. We live in that moment. Everyone's familiar with this. And we're back to the public sphere again, stories that we can tell, and it's talk about dialogue, having conversations. You know, that was sort of the capaciousness, the openness. But the Toni Morrison angle is that she talks about the dangers of status language that constrict things can be told in one way, like there's a snake, there's an Aesop fable, this is how it is. Where she gave a Nobel address about the bird in the hand, and then that she begins 3 different times. Once upon a time, there was an old woman, wise and blind. These kids come to her, say, "Old lady, you know, what do we have in our hands? Bird, alive or dead? The bird." One of the readings in its language. And so I began actually once upon a time in Cambodia. Once upon a time, I sort of built that in. But the idea there is it's open, it's capacious, it's multivalent, it's not constricted. The juxtaposition of sort of political ideology versus literature and the evocative nature of that, again, in terms of the stories you can tell, that sort of, but you know, we're in this moment where constriction of speech is really, even more so than in 2018, 2016, 2020, we're really headed for it. And just getting back to the ability for people to be able to speak to one another, even if they have very different views. And usually the thing is, if you have dialogue with people, you're red or blue, you have dialogue with someone, you say the first thing is, what stereotypes do you think people, let's say I'm a red and I'm talking to someone who's blue, what stereotypes do you have? And well, you're a bunch of racists, and it's like very quickly that sort of disabuse that. Same thing when you think about a bunch of woke socialist communists, you know, and you start moving past that. The problem is that we're in this sort of singular, these essentialized views of each other, and it sort of wraps around to the question I was going to ask you. So it's a good one. Is, you know, the incredible cutting edge work in the area that really has never been explored, and your point is made. So to back up in terms of sort of the next move, sort of bring it back a little bit, how do you negotiate gray zone? And in this, I was thinking, wasn't actually education after Auschwitz and Adorno, and talking about the dangers of re-education, which again is something that we all engage in, right? And so how do we bring it back to the performative, the spectacular? And it can easily play into preconceptions of the perpetrator as monster who's other than us. And so how do you bring it back into that sort of gray zone as the next step?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, because it can lead you to kind of a caricature of what perpetrators are. So how do you do that? I think there's a couple of things. So from a social science perspective, if we look at psychologists talking about, what percentage of the population out of 100 are psychopaths, right? I think the number is anywhere from 2.5% to 5%. So as Chris Browning talks about with Police Battalion 21, the vast majority of perpetrators are quite ordinary in quotation. So I think that's an important thing. The other thing that I think helps us to humanize this, not abstract, reify, is looking at the testimony of the witnesses and survivors, because the words that they use, the language that they use to describe what's happening, gives us really a way to think about what the perpetrators are doing. And to say, so when in doing the last book, as people are looking at what's happening in Eastern Europe, as these Nazi killing teams are working through Eastern Europe, they come up with this expression, it's like a wedding atmosphere. And I want you to think about what that means, because we're talking about people who live in small community, artisans, tradesmen, farmers, livestock dealers. So they're in these small shtetls or villages. What to them is the most joyous day of the year? Well, it's going to be a wedding. And why is that? Because on a wedding day, the community will celebrate as a whole. There'll be lots to drink, lots of food. There'll be music and celebration. So what is the word? What is the kind of concept that these people in these communities are transposing as they're seeing their communities wiped out on the part of the perpetrator? It's a wedding atmosphere. And so using their language to think about how the perpetrators are acting, I think gives us insights, and this can be in other situations as well. It gives us really insights into understanding what the people on the ground were seeing, not what I'm imposing on the perpetrators, but how those who are involved are seeing. So that's kind of the way that I look at this. But the idea of camaraderie, I think, is really an important point, because these social groups that develop and the way that masculinity can play a role in that, and camaraderie. I mean, for everyone in this room who's been on a sports team or been in a club, you immediately understand there's positive effects of camaraderie. But we don't often think about the flip side and the negative effects of that. And especially in these societies in which, as Providence talked about today, radio and media start to engage in dialogue that's othering the other groups. And then the way in which groups then gather around, gather kind of into those groups.
So, and of course, the title of the panel is Genocidal State, and I think one of the things that's really interesting about what you're presenting, and by the way, this is me stalling, so you can see the question. And so one of the things that's really interesting is that you have, in some ways, the genocidal state as a state apparatus. So this is a question, by the way, genocide studies, like whether or not a genocide can occur that doesn't involve a state apparatus. And how much of that is actually by design, and then how much of that is organic, right? And so in thinking about, for instance, sexual violence, that is something that was often thought of being ancillary, or something that's happened alongside a war when it's planned. And then we see through the ICCR, through the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, we have somebody called Andrew who's actually held responsible for actually using that as a plan to enforce and so I think it's very interesting how you're kind of complicating this idea of how the state plays a role, and then how much of that happens amongst the people, and how there's cultural kind of references and symbols that are part of how some of that organically, quote unquote, might happen. So thank you. That's an excellent presentation by both of you. So we'll do one more round of applause. I can't clap enough. We'll do another one at the end. So if you do have a question, I'd like to open it up. We have about 15 minutes, and if you could keep your questions, I think about 30 seconds, answering or asking your question, and we do have one person that's online that will get to. So I think if it's okay with you, I'll just go from my right to my left. And so we'll start here. I have one hand. I think I have two more. Make sure you do some, don't miss you. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, thank you. Good morning. Thank you. Sorry. So, this bill is called the Genocide State, and I actually could be taken out in two ways. They make presentation like the state as a sort of like the nation state, also state as an asset, right? With like the state of genocide, like the condition that was within the nation of atrocity. So I wonder if you could talk about the relationship between sort of the interpersonal state when it's in genocide and the state apparatus, so like the mechanisms, the institutions that promote this type of stuff. And for some of you, I think I might maybe take 2 questions at a time that might help facilitate. So I think we all got to.
Yeah, my question is mostly for Ed, and if this is too much, feel free to ignore it, of course. But
If I can't answer it, I'll.
there's a danger of, I think I might be essentializing here, but what is the primary purpose, do you think, functionally of that genocidal camaraderie? As you were talking, I was thinking about, is this part of the necessary normalization of violence and camaraderie? That's an important point in military stuff. Is it a way to connect perpetrators and collaborators? That's basically saying we're all in this together. That I thought about that, or even just the separation of us versus them. In a sense of I'm an early modernist, and I was thinking about early modern public executions and how absolutely visceral they can be, but it was kind of like what you were saying here, treated like a spectator sport with people selling souvenirs and everything. So, thank you.
Okay. Number one, the first question, that's a really great question. And I think they're self-referential, right? So the idea of the state and the idea of the actors, they work together, right? And they feed on each other. And in the case of, if we're talking Nazi Germany, or in the case of Rwanda and Providence, I'd be interested in hearing your take on this. The way in which the state apparatus promotes these ideas, that gives license to actors to act on them, right? And your question also gets to a much larger debate in the Holocaust about the center versus the periphery, and how much the center guides action or how much the periphery drives the action. And to say this very briefly, I think that can also be a very too simplistic, because Berlin is the center. In Latvia, Riga is the periphery, but in Latvia itself, Riga is the center, and Liepāja, a killing area, can be the periphery. So center and periphery also fractalize in that way.
Well, thanks for going back. So I sort of laid it out, trying to have that stairwell, spiral staircase. Actually comes from a dream I had that I tell, and book Matter Monster. I sort of turned it into a device thinking about this. But in the same way, if you're at the bottom looking up, I think of that as the micro level. Well, how much can you understand on the sort of micro level, right? So we're back to the perpetrators, executioners, S21 prison. We talk to them, what they say. If you move up to, say, the top of it, and you look down, and each time you move, you lose sight of the other one. That's the danger, right? You can go to the macro level, we can evolve. So I was talking about modernity. You can have all sorts of things. Sometimes the nation's thrown in there, nationalism. You have these factors, but then you lose sight of what's below. And then we have sort of the basal level in between, which could be the group level, community level, what have you. And so in terms of explanation, there's a danger of reverting to one of those levels and to really have a dynamic explanation that's kind of granular, but takes account of all these levels. I think of the top level as setting the table, right? So the policy, and I laid that in my presentation, the policy, the abstract design, the rhetoric that goes down, it comes down to Deutsch, who's in the middle level, and he's operating the prison. And he, in turn, is then setting the table for the actors on the ground, and you get the connection between the two, but you can't explain either alone. So you really have to be able to weave between those levels. And the description, I can't quote the description of this. I think in terms of the nation, nationalism, you specifically put in the sort of movement up and down between these different levels of analysis. Yeah, so the danger is we always want easy, quick explanations. And that's always a difficult thing. It's much more complicated and it varies by person.
Stephen's question, I'm sorry, Stephen, I didn't answer Stephen's. Just to get back to your question, Stephen, I think it's a really good question. I think that can you have a genocidal state without genocidal camaraderie, the way I'm thinking about it. I definitely think mass violence in general, whether it's lynching, whether it's other things, requires some type of group cohesion normally, right? And so the question really becomes scope, scale, and timeline that technology is built into there. And then how that state also reinforces those actions. So it's a good question. I don't think I have an answer yet. I'm at the beginning of this, but it's something we're going to
So one, and then, Jonathan, you have a question? Yeah, so I'll have to, you want to ask your question, Jonathan?
Sure. This must be for Alex. I was thinking about the part of your presentation about how during the peer reviewing of select one, and then kind of tying that now in like America and most of the countries, we can tell whatever place wants. So I want to ask, what do you think the role is of like empathy in sharing a narrative about something for like the community side? Do you think that's like one of the ways to kind of find common ground on these like something?
I had a question about self-understanding of these perpetrators in both of your papers. So as I study Nazi Germany, I always look at ways in which the perpetrators, even going into these dark places, or in the case of Cambodia, still see themselves as maintaining certain humanity. So, and I think you can think of maybe the speech in 1943 by Himmler saying, despite all that we've done and seen, we still have maintained our humanism. I'm curious, even beyond the very sort of ideologically or statement, let's say, of the defendant in your case in Cambodia, do you witness even some of these people complaining or that they still maintain their humanity through these horrors? Or in the case of Cambodia, it's simply just like we are ideologically sound and we saw them as enemies? Or in the case of these spectacular violent moments, do they come out still saying that beyond, in a way, boys will be boys, but we're still good people?
Yeah, so I'll take that. So that Himmler speech at Poznan, right, where he said he wants his men to remain decent, right? He says he wants decent murderers, right? That's the term that he uses. He doesn't want them to become these kind of, if you will, wild kind of barbaric killers. I think what we see, though, and my answer to that would be, that's his kind of rhetorical way of thinking good German decent men who kill the right way, not gratuitously, not with barbarity. But it's the reframing of the moral frameworks of who's protected and who's not, right? So, you know, as you talked about, the idea that the Nazi universe of morality, there are people that are in it, and it's dirty work to have to kill. They use it, Sauerei, right? That's the German term. But it's necessary, right? To protect that other moral universe, which is this Aryanite kind of ideal. So I think that othering process that others have talked about, normative framework, shifting normative framework, that's the way I think that it comes to mind.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the humanity question, you know, so I guess my last book, it's called Perpetrators, co-written with Tony Brodman, who works in Argentina. Perpetrators there, and we divide into 3 sections, and we try to chapter in each, and some stuff going on. But the first one's about interviewing perpetrators, and it gets into precisely this question, and the necessity to enter into a space of humanity, to recognize this kind of type of what you're talking about as well, to recognize that you're talking to a human being and not a monster. We talk about our experiences doing it. The second one, we talk about dreaming. I sort of take Tony underwent analysis talks about that. I mean, this is in Argentina, everyone's in analysis in Argentina, right? The highest population, highest number of people in analysis in the world. But, you know, I talked about the impact on, you know, perpetrator research, where kind of run you take in. Really difficult. Writing about that chapter on, you know, my book, Monster on torture, really hard. I'm sure you got this, where you get stained and you know, it's hard to work through it. And then the last thing is about writing, and I actually kind of titled my chapter curation, in the sense that you're curating in some form that's appropriate, but it's also for yourself material. So some of those issues, but the granular one about that intersubjective space is absolutely critical. Perpetrators, you know, when you talk to them, talk to lots of people who torturers, you know, who's been in mass killings, you know, and they'll always say, I'm just following orders. Sometimes they'll say, well, I believed at the time, I don't believe it now. Sometimes they'll say, I would have been shot. And yeah, you know, like tool slang, this is sort of a difference between, like last night you said, you know, you wouldn't have been, you would be demoted, do some bad work. At S21, that prison, if you refused orders, you would have been killed. Right? There's just no question about that. No one could say. People were constantly paranoid about not showing a proper revolutionary consciousness. But this again is in a institutional space. As you go out, the sort of institutional constraint loosens. Even there, you know, there are a few things that have. Doig says you should not be joking when you're torturing. It's not fun. A little bit of that, but it was a serious place. But if you go out in the countryside, you have to phone it up. It becomes more loose, but people were always watching. And you always could be accused of being a traitor, and lots of people, there were massive purges going on. So it's sort of like a little bit of a difference and similarity and a difference between the two cases. But I just wanted to go back to the empathy thing, because I think it's important, you know, none of us wants to be close to the space of a perpetrator because they're monstrous acts. The Adorno essay, you know, it's like teaching essay, education after Auschwitz. The basic argument is the conditions that produced Auschwitz are all around us. Our subjectivity, our sense of identity is formed in historical context. We constantly reify, we constantly other people. And so your question points out the very challenge, which is to constantly understand our context, to try and understand how our identities were formed, how we are reifying, how we're othering, which goes back to your question as well. And it's not easy to do. For example, in those conversations, the hardest thing is to go, say you're red or blue nowadays, and to say, well, so I'll be red, right, or blue. I might be wrong. No one wants to be wrong. It doesn't feel good. But it's like having this openness to have those conversations. That demands empathy, recognizing the humanity of the other person, and just a willingness to talk. Maybe not argue immediately about the biggest point of contention. Anyway, it's a great question.
Unfortunately, we're running really tight on time, so I hope the 15 or 20 minutes be enough. So I think we might have time for one more quick question. And I think I missed somebody in the middle. I think I passed over twice, but I don't see them raising their hand again. So yeah, so we're gonna end quite aptly here. And it wasn't all my questions, to the extent that we can leave your response into the question that's coming up, which is about, can you discuss women perpetrators and brutality as a way of proving their value to male perpetrators? So we might be able to use that into the response. So please, you got your question. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Oh, perfect. So I would like to continue what about how we really doing the same time. Well, really, you also have that none, we are not saying, have people other things our country is of course they used to might be young before they define but yeah, so this is going to the line, keeping the line as the beginning, like even if they are mothers that bring you, that they may be able to adjust it, but because the line I think it's good. And again, for the country, we're preaching really, where we are,
I apologize. So is there, do you want to make a comment or is there a question as well?
I'm saying something new.
Okay, so I just want to make sure I was listening to your question.
Yeah. Okay. So pretty much I'm saying that not only women, and it's now, yeah, and still they are living outside of Rwanda, genocide, genocide, as well as they usually say, you know, genocide or police others. I was encouraged to say,
Great. Thank you for providing that further commentary.
And just to your online question,
Yeah.
kind of close the loop on that. I think it's a really good question. I talked about it last night. There's a case of in Nazi Germany, there's very defined gender roles, men and women. And women, a good German woman, for example, quote unquote, doesn't drink or smoke. She's in the home, she's having lots of children. However, I've got the case of Erna Petrie, who's the wife of an SS man. He has an estate in Ukraine, and on that estate, every once in a while, Jews will be found. And her husband executes those Jews on the estate. She runs across 4 young Jewish boys who have escaped from a deportation. They don't have clothes on. And she doesn't really know what to do with them at first. She actually gives them food. She's waiting for her husband to come home. And then when he doesn't come home, she decides to execute these 4 boys herself in the area of the estate where the executions take place. And it's only later when she's being interrogated by the East German police on a different subject that this comes out. And when she finally, after the interrogation, he says, "But why did you kill the boys?" And she finally says, "I was an SS wife. I didn't want to stand behind the men." So what she was doing is she was appropriating an identity that was tied to a masculine identity. Why could she do that? Because the East was a zone of exception where the rules didn't apply the way they did in Germany. Just like the concentration camps, for those concentration camp guards gave them the ability not to perform as women in Nazi Germany, but to perform to the standards of men, SS.
Like a 30-second.
This might be interesting point of contrast, somewhat contrast. We have similarities as well. But with Marxist-Leninism, Khmer Rouge, the goal was to create sort of a uniform person. So, for example, all women cut their hair short. Everybody, ideally, variation, dressed the same way. Everyone's supposed to act the same way. Women were supposed to take on the same roles, and it didn't really happen often. They also were perpetrators. So it's slightly different. There, the state ideal, though, is that women and men should be the same. The stuff you say does take place as well. Yeah.
So I apologize to those of you whose questions I did not get to. I know there's like a gentleman here and I didn't get to, so I apologize. But we do have our speakers here for the next 10 minutes before our next presentation. Perhaps you can ask it then. Oh, yes. So we have lunch. Oh, that'd be better. Yes.
1:30.
And at 1:30, we're going to do review. And so thank you again. One last round of applause.